we live? Okay. All right, well, thanks for joining us here again.
You gotta stop stepping that
No, I'm gonna sway.
But every time you step that way, you cover your head. There you go. Okay. Now you're good.
Can I sway now?
A little bit.
I have to move some. So, thank you for joining us as always, and of course a shout out to our Patreon subscribers, Karen Lee Duffel, Chris Lee, and Yiffy Winkler, who subscribed to the Patreon last week. So we appreciate that. We should mention, of course, also Karen Lee, very sus. So I saw Karen faking tasks. This week I just kind of decided that we haven't talked about communism, so I would talk about that. I was sort of going to talk about Chinese communism, like communism in China, communist China. But when Dara posted things, she just sort of said communism more broadly. So I guess we'll just do that.
I'm still of the opinion that most people don't actually know what communism is. So
okay. So I guess let's talk about that, right? And so, as always, if you're here, drop us a hello in the comments so that we can give you a shout out. If you have a question or clarification, or you wanted to say something, do it. Dara is always manning the comments, is happy to carry your feedback over so we can hear what you got to say. So the thing about communism, I guess, is it goes back to the French Revolution, where the French Revolution in 1789 overthrew all of the old ideas and social organization and society in Europe. Like it just sort of got rid of all of it. And in history, they even call the way that France was before the revolution, they call it the Ancien Regime, the old regime, because they want to draw like a line in France between like before the revolution and after. And of course, it wasn't as complete as that. I mean, it wasn't a total rejection, because the 19th century in France was really a fight about whether or not the revolution was good or bad. And parts of it kept coming back, and parts of the old regime kept coming back. And there was this big fight that really went on until about 1940, when the division in France was sort of papered over by the crushing of France at the hands of the Nazis. And so more than an actual rejection of the old regime, one thing you say about the French Revolution is it sort of seemed to make it so that all new ideas and new things were possible, right? There was nothing that was off limits to sort of like consider, no idea that was too radical, no tradition that was not worthy to be questioned. And so that's sort of part of where you get the introduction of these ideas that become communism, is this idea that like if we agree that our society is fundamentally flawed, and a la the Enlightenment of the 16 and 1700s, we agree that like we should try to fix it, and we can using our reason. Then, you know, some people are inevitably going to lean towards like, let's not just tinker around the edges. Let's have a wholesale kind of reconsideration of our entire society. Right. And so you get a bunch of different guys who adopt the name socialists. There are scientific socialists and utopian socialists, and there's an entire Christian religious tradition of socialism, communal living and stuff. But by and large, these guys didn't sort of come to a lot. Right. But the most famous of them, of course, is one of the scientific socialists, who is Karl Marx. Marx is from Trier, in Germany. He goes to this college in Trier. He's not from there. And supposedly the story is that he was in law school, as pre-law, and he goes into a lecture, a philosophy lecture by Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, the most important 19th century philosopher. And he sat through one lecture that he just wandered into it, I guess. And he walked to the registrar and said, "What does that guy teach?" That was in like auditorium 2. And I was like, "Oh, that's Hegel. He's a philosopher." And Marx was like, "I want to take whatever degree means I have to take his classes." And so he ended up becoming a student of Hegel. And so Hegelianism, or the Hegelians as his followers are known, Hegel believed that history functioned according to a process, a formula, right? Just like Darwin is going to argue that life started simple and ended up complex. Complexity was the product of a long process. Remember, it's not always the end result. Complex does not always mean better. And according to our modern understanding of Darwinism, you can go from complex to simple and back. But of course, you always have to start simple and then build complexity into the system. Hegel argued that all of history followed this paradigm that you could understand. It all fit together in a complicated web. And to put it very bluntly, Hegel argued that every era of history is divided into these sort of loosely defined eras. And a part of the job of a Hegelian would be to identify the era, right? To sort of break history into these component chunks, right? And so, in each era, there was an idea called the thesis. It was the defining characteristic of the age, whatever it was, right? And that thesis would naturally give rise to an idea that was the opposite, which was called the antithesis. And the engine of historical process, the thing that created the conflict and the events of history in an age was the conflict between the thesis and the antithesis, right? Wars would be fought over it, books would be written, works of art would be created to justify or to attack one or the other. And at the end of the era, there would be this kind of conflict that would see the resolution of this crisis by one of the two winning. And that would become the sort of new idea of the next stage. But wait, in defeating the opposite idea, the new idea would absorb some of the ideas of the defeated one, right? So the thesis would defeat the antithesis, but in so doing, kind of adopt some parts of it, right? To incorporate some features of it, and thus you get what's called a synthesis, right? And in the next era, the synthesis of the era you're in is the thesis of the next era. It becomes the defining idea that characterizes this age of history, right? And so you can argue that Hegel's work, if you want to use the technical terminology, and of course I do, is highly reductionist, right? It boils, all of human history can be boiled down into a single, it's a sort of X versus Y, right? And in some cases you can look, you say, okay, yeah, maybe the 20th century really was about capitalistic democracy versus socialistic, communistic authoritarianism, at least apart from 1945 to 1991, right? But like, that ignores a lot of other stuff, and it assumes that everybody gets enlisted as a foot soldier of either idea A or B, right? There's no room for people who are just like, these ideas are both dumb, right? It's like, no, you have to pick a side, right? And it just seems a little too pat, right? But his idea was hugely influential. One of his students, Karl Marx, goes on to write a series of books, right? And he wrote, there are some books we can mention. One book he wrote was called The 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, which was a scathing and incredible work of satire about the foibles of the mid 19th century French king Louis Napoleon, and how he unwittingly repeated history by attempting to do what his relative Napoleon had done and sort of take over France, and except it failed, right? And Marx famously said in there, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does copy itself the first time as tragedy and the second as farce. Right? Because everybody looked at Louis Napoleon and thought, we live in a shitty age, and this is our shitty, crappy, great value Napoleon, as opposed to the really good one that our grandfathers had, right? And so Marx's other really significant work, there's a couple. There's the Grundrisse and the German ideology, whatever. But the big one that gets a lot of attention is this book called Das Kapital. And in it, Marx takes Hegel's arguments and transposes them into economics. He argues that all history can be understood as economic history. All history is just really economics. It's like a foil wrapped chocolate candy. The exterior of culture, warfare, religion, it's all just a superstructure, and you unfold it, and the chocolate inside is really just economics. That's what really history is. And Marx argues all history is class struggle. It's all, the entire history of the world can be divided, can essentially be analyzed, understood completely as an analysis of the fight between the haves and the have-nots. And the haves always want to make sure that they have more than anyone else, and the have-nots always want to get what the haves have and they don't have. And that's everything. That's the entire history of the world in one sentence. As poor people get screwed by rich people, and eventually maybe they get together and fight for it, or they just get screwed and that's it, right? And Marx wrote 2,000 pages to try to explain how everybody from Chinese peasants to Egyptian pyramid builders to slaves in ancient Rome, all the way up to African American slaves in the United States, were sort of fit into this pattern. And Marx's history, it's valuable in a way, if you study history, to be able to look at history from a Marxist perspective. And it is reasonable to point out that economics does have a certain primacy in everybody's life, right? I mean, at the end of the day, you have to go to work, earn a paycheck, have a living. Every human being has to eat, needs shelter, food, material resources. The struggle for material survival has been the defining aspect of human history that we have in common with everybody going back to the earliest humans. So you can sort of argue that like Marx is not wrong, and a lot of historians, hey, girls, we're going to need to keep the talking less because I'm recording, or I'm going to get really angry. Thanks. Okay. And so you can kind of argue that Marx is like onto something, but of course, look at 9/11. Was 9/11 about economics? Well, you can argue, okay, oil and whatever, but I mean, if you listen to bin Laden and the guys that committed 9/11, they had these sort of ideological motives, right? Bin Laden was very clear. America supports the Jews in Israel. America supports dictators that oppress Muslims in the Middle East, and America stations soldiers in the holy places of Islam. Those are not really economic motives. He didn't fly, planes into the Twin Towers and kill like 3,300 people because he felt economically dispossessed. He did it because he had these ideological motives that don't really. Marx would be like, well, he's confused and whatever. And Marx's history is very much you only have square pegs. And sometimes the square peg goes in the square hole, and it's like great. And sometimes there's a round hole, and you have to be like, well, the hole is wrong, right? Like it doesn't understand it's supposed to be square, right? And so Marx's writing was really influential. And there's some other good stuff you can say about it. He pointed out that all history is a history of class struggle, and really, there's sort of two periods in history you need to understand. There's basically all of history up to the recent past. And then Marx is writing in the mid-1800s, and he's like, the recent past is different because of industrialization, right? For the first time in human history, you have factories, machines, capitalism, money, labor. All of these things changed the way the economy worked. This was all different, right? Peasants and factory workers are both equally oppressed, but the factory workers are oppressed in this kind of fundamentally new and different way that nobody's ever been oppressed before, right? He talked a lot about, for example, the labor theory of value. If you work on a farm, you produce actual things. Your labor goes into making things. If you work in a factory, you operate a machine, and the machine is the valuable thing. You're just the energy input. You're just the guy that pulls the lever. You don't really have value. Your labor has been, he calls it, alienated from the value that it would normally possess if you were like a craftsman, right? If you actually made something, you're a wood carver, you have new skills. You can just leave and do that on your own. But as a guy that operates an automatic lathe, you're just a guy that pulls a lever. You just put the little board in and pull the lever and get a table leg out. And like anybody could do that. Your skills have been essentially edited out of the system by the logic of capitalism, right? And so this is just really fascinating stuff to think about, because Marx is right. His description of society is possessing a fundamental problem in that by the mid-1800s, the vast majority of people in Europe are poor, have-nots, and a small percentage are haves, and the gulf between the haves and the have-nots is now almost indescribable. I mean, he's right. And he argued this sort of the social question. He said that's the most important question of our time, and you're not really going to be able to have settlement in our society until we figure it out, right? And even today, we're still arguing. People say the 1% or income inequality and stuff. All billionaires should not exist. That's all sort of an allusion to the same problem, right? Marx, if he were here today, would say, so you people haven't figured it out any more than we did, right? I mean, you still haven't figured out how to prevent a small number of people from essentially controlling the economy, and they get unimaginable wealth, which of course allows them to come up with quasi-legal ways to keep that money, right? They manipulate the tax code, they put their money in offshore bank accounts, they lobby politicians to the tune of billions of dollars, and that's all the stuff that Marx is saying. It's like, oh, well, how are you going to do this, right? And so Marx wrote Das Kapital. It was published in a variety of European languages. He wrote it, by the way, by crashing on his friend Friedrich Engels' couch in England. Engels wrote a really good book about British working class people called The Condition of the Working Class in England, which is really easy to read. It's really a good read, and it's really an honest book where he did sociological field work and talked to poor people and was like trying to ask them, like, what's your life like? What do you eat? What do you feed your kids? Do your kids go to school? What do you want your life to be like? What are you mad about? And so it's a really interesting book in that regard. And you can go to the British Museum in London, and that's where Marx wrote Das Kapital. He checked books out of the reading room and wrote it all at a desk, right? And it's, by the way, fun story, in the 80s, they translated Das Kapital into Russian, and the Russian censors were alert for communism, but they let Das Kapital go through, even though Marx wrote it, and the censor wrote the Tsar a note when the Tsar was like, what's up, why do we do this? And the censor wrote back, well, Your Majesty, this book is so long and complicated, no one is going to read it anyway. And so it doesn't really matter if we translate it into Russian. And the Tsar was like, good point, okay. And you could buy legal copies of Karl Marx's economics books in Russia. But in the middle of the 19th century, Marx and Engels got together and founded a union, the International Working Man's Association, and they published the Communist Manifesto, a little pamphlet trying to explain what they were doing. And it ended with this real memorable phrase: "Workers of the world, unite! You have nothing to lose but your chains." Right? And Karl Marx thought the ultimate remedy for the problems of industrial capitalism is for all the working class people to unite. I mean, if you go to a town like Birmingham in England, there's like, I don't know what, a couple hundred people in the town who are capitalists, right? Who are factory owners and like merchants and like bankers and their families. On the other hand, how many people in the town are factory workers? 20, 40,000, you know? I mean, if they got together, they could easily seize control of the means of production, is what Marx said. Occupy the factory, seize it, kill the factory owner, and then divide the factory up amongst themselves, or better yet, create a government that would just own the factory for them. And then they would go to work for each other, right? Instead of going to work for the capitalists, they would go to work in the factory for everybody, right? And they would just divide the profit of the factory up equally among all the workers instead of giving it to some guy in a mansion, right? And so for Marx, that revolution was what was going to allow society to change. He said, the point about history is when all of the people are oppressed, but the gap isn't as wide or whatever, there's not enough motivation. But when you get a situation like you have in Europe, you have this tiny number of people oppressing this huge number of people, and the gap is so high, that's going to heighten people's awareness. It's going to heighten their willingness to do this. And I mean, now you have stuff like guns. I mean, it wouldn't be very hard for people. I mean, the capitalist can fortify himself in his mansion, but I mean, against 10,000 workers armed with guns, what's he going to do, right? Like realistically, with the numbers on their side, the revolutionaries would seize it. And so Marx argued that the most likely countries to revolt communist-wise would be the most industrialized, right? You could draw a graph. Most industrialized, most likely to revolt. Well, it never happened. And the first time anyone got a taste of communism was in 1871 when the Germans invaded France. The French foolishly thought they could beat the Germans. They got crushed. The Germans seized 2 French provinces. They crowned their king, emperor in Versailles, the old French palace. And then on top of that, they formed the German Empire, right? And in response, the enraged Paris mob, always a bit revolutionary, they formed this thing called the Paris Commune, right? And that's where you get the term communist in kind of general sort of circulation. The people in the Paris Commune call themselves communards, which is stupid. And some newspaper was like, we'll just call them communists. And everybody's like, ooh, that's a good name. And so, and they divided everything up equally for this short period of time until the German government and the army left and the French government came in and slaughtered tens of thousands of its own citizens. They had this kind of collective communist sort of government. And that's where the spectacle or the specter of communism began to sort of haunt Europe, right? And so it's worth drawing a distinction between socialism and communism. These are very elastic terms, and it's not like people who don't like socialism and communism tend to use them as interchangeable things. Communists and socialists tend not to. Communists tend to use them interchangeably because they want the less scary term socialist to apply, even though perhaps the more scary term communist does. But socialists tend to be people who pursue these kind of things through the democratic means, right? Not, in other words, you can identify that everything Karl Marx said was correct in terms of his description, but his prescription, violent revolution, maybe not so good. And so a socialist would say, let's do those things, but like with voting, right? Like let's have the government pursue policies that would tend to fix these issues rather than, like let's all take to the streets and butcher the local factory owner, right? And so particularly in the 20th century in Europe, when communism became a really big thing, the democratic socialists in Western Europe were very clear that they didn't view themselves as revolutionary socialists, right? That's why they call themselves democratic socialists instead of revolutionary socialists, right? And so the term is often somewhat fungible. And what communists also argue is that when you get hardcore communism in the late 19th century, is that socialism is what we're going to do now. It's the thing that we're going to achieve now, right? And in the future, in some far-off distant future, when we've established socialism, naturally communism will sort of flow from that. And so communism is the goal, but socialism is like the way to operationalize it, right? That's what you have to do to get to communism, right? And in communism, everything will just naturally be organized. It's almost in a sense libertarian. I mean, everything will just naturally be shared. You'll create this new group of people who have this ethic of communal responsibility and sharing and everything. And so you won't need the government, you won't need political parties, you won't need any of this stuff. It'll just all get kind of shared. It'll all happen organically. The government will wither away is the phrase they use, which is, of course, it's just like any religion. frankly, it's kind of BS. Right? And in a way, communism is essentially a secular religion in that it's a set of beliefs that are taken from a holy book and a prophet. And if you believe them and follow them, good things happen to you. Right? And in that sense, communism has a lot of the features of a religion. And if you just do the thing, if we just support it all in the future, everything will be like great. Right? So when has communism actually happened? Well, nowhere, right? There are communist parties, particularly in Germany. There's a really active one. There's a small one in England. There is a relatively moderately sized one in America. It's never very successful because, of course, in America, you don't have like an autocratic monarchy. You have a democratic government. And so the communists are always, I think it was H.L. Mencken who said every American is essentially, he sees himself as essentially a temporarily distressed millionaire. Right? Every American thinks he's just one good idea or one big lucky break away from being the next, Henry Ford or Carnegie or whatever. So it's a little more difficult to convince Americans of the necessity of violent revolution. Plus, the Democratic Socialists have a huge advantage in that you can actually vote for stuff, right? I mean, like voting actually works in America as opposed to like Russia or something where it doesn't, right? And so the first communist revolution actually happens in Russia. During World War I, the Russian government gets involved in the war. We've talked about this before. And the government collapses, basically, because, among other things, they can't win the war. The military is under-equipped. The government's stupid. The czar is even dumber. And it just doesn't work. The economy is just already on the ropes, and the war does not help it out very much. And so the Germans, knowing that the Russian government is on the verge of collapse, send a revolutionary socialist back to Russia. His name is Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, and he goes by the name Lenin. Lenin's father, I think, was a school teacher. He went to college for a while, but his older brother got caught up in a plot to assassinate the Tsar and executed. Lenin got a reprieve, but he didn't quit being a revolutionary, so the cops got after him, so he flees to the West. And he and his wife, her name was Natalia Kurupskaya. They went to Germany, Switzerland, England, and kind of lived abroad for a number of years. He's in Switzerland when the Germans approach him and are like, look, if you got a train ticket back to Russia, that would that work out for you? And of course, Lenin makes this sort of literal deal with the devil, right? I mean, the Germans are the arch conservatives, but on the other hand, like they're offering you the chance to go back to Russia, which you couldn't do on your own, at a time when the Russian government is about as stable as a wet cardboard box, and you really have a chance of this is you wait for your whole life is for a revolution to break out, right? And so Lenin takes the deal, and of course spends the rest of his life covering up the fact that the Germans ever helped him. Right? And he ends up in Russia in 1917, and of course there's revolution and whatever. And what happens is that Lenin's faction of communists, they call themselves the Bolsheviks. And Bolshevik in Russian means majority. And the reason is that the Communist Party splits into two factions, and it splits over the necessity of violent revolution, right? And so, are you here to hang out with your friends? Yeah. Look, your friend Tim is here. Don't you love him? That's great. Well, Fang is always, he whores himself out to anyone who will scratch his head and give him love. So, but also he does love you. He does love you very much. Yeah. But I mean, Fang is always about like, can I snuggle someone on the couch? Yeah, you're going to know in a minute. But I mean, you love Fang, so Fang is especially happy to be here with you. But like, he's not going to be over here. I can't pet him, right? You're over there scratching his head. Who do you think he's going to be? Yeah, I know you. It's this one over here who is like, look at these people who don't live with me. I love them so much. And then like, you'll be throwing up on my feet tonight, won't you? Poop in the bath? Yeah, but licking this morning she went for my underarm hair. And I'm like, what are you going to do if you get it? You're going to bite it? You're going to lick it? It's disgusting. Or she'll just poop in the bathroom again. Yeah. We think, because Fang probably ate it. Anyway. So Lenin's faction believes in, it's sort of an idea, today a variant of this idea is called accelerationism. And so basically Lenin's idea is that in Russia you don't have a very big working class, called the proletariat. You don't have a big factory class. There's not a lot of factories. Not a lot of factories, not a lot of workers, right? So your primary people that would revolt, they don't exist, right? So for Lenin, what you got to do is you've got to accelerate people's revolutionary desire. And the way to do it is what he calls the vanguard. You've got to have a small group of committed revolutionaries who are dedicated to making a revolution happen, principally through the use of violence, right? And doing this, by the way, will do what Lenin calls heightening the contradictions in the system, right? So what you do is you do something that is maybe like ethically not illegal, but legally illegal, like to exercise free speech, right? And you should say this free speech should totally be, should be legal, right? And of course it's not. So the czar punishes you, and then you free your buddies from prison. You kill a bunch of prison guards, or the cops go to arrest you, you shoot them. Right, and then of course what will happen is the cops will crack down. Right, the cops naturally will go after the people that committed murder, right, killed their fellow police officers, and as a result, the crackdown. There's a really good scene in Monty Python and the Holy Grail when King Arthur comes across the guy in the mud puddle, and he's beating the guy because the guy doesn't accept Arthur as the king of the Britons, and the guy's shouting, "Look, I'm being repressed. I'm being repressed." Witness the inherent contradictions inherent in the system. Witness the oppression inherent in the system. That's what Lenin would say you have to do. You have to get yourself in a position where the police use their authority, the government uses its authority in an unjust way, so that you can say to everybody, "Look what's happening. Like, look at this," and it will radicalize people. And the way to do it is to have this motivated revolutionary vanguard that will use violence to kind of push the system along, right? It's like you're pushing somebody down a road. They're not really paying attention. It's like my kid is walking down the street with me, and I want to go from A to B, and she's just wandering around. You got to kind of push her and be like, let's go, come on, let's go. And you got to kind of make it happen. All right. And it works. Within a short amount of time, Lenin is in charge in Russia. They overthrow the government that succeeded Nicholas. They, of course, execute him and his family. Right, and Lenin is in control of the government. That happened, right? They killed the mother, the father, the 4 daughters, the son, and then the nurse. Kind of Nicholas's fault. He got to be in a room with his kids when they got machine gunned, which is terrible. But on the other hand, like, boy, if you hadn't been such a dumbass, that wouldn't happen. Yeah, absolutely, I would. He's a dumbass. I mean, is it victim blaming when you have someone in your arms and you jump off a roof and you both die? Well, yes. I mean, you chose to do that. So it kind of was your fault, right? Like, you didn't have to. You jumped. Yeah. Well, I mean, okay. So, I guess, but you probably could come up with a better analogy. But like Nicholas's death was the consequences of decisions he'd been making for 25 years. And he had total power in the system. He was the autocrat. Who can you blame for Russia if not the guy who has total control of Russia, right? I mean, he's not just some random asshole. He's the emperor. Doesn't remember what Truman said? The buck stops here. Even more so for Nicholas than Truman, because Truman was the president, right? He wasn't the dictator. Anyway, what else can we say about communism? Well, Lenin finds himself in a terrible position because to solidify rule of the communists in Russia, he signs a treaty with the Germans at the town of Brest-Litovsk in 1918. And it gets the Germans and the Russians out of the war with each other, ends World War I in the East, and it surrenders hundreds of thousands of square miles of Russia to the Germans. And in return, it gets the Germans, all the soldiers fighting Russia can go west and fight Britain, France, and now America. Lenin is asked, how can you countenance the surrender of Ukraine, Belarusia, huge chunks of like Finland, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, whatever, to the Germans? And he says, look, we're going to get all this crap back. We're going to fix it later. But he said also the 2 things that the Russians got me in power demanding were bread and peace, right? So like I kind of have to provide those. I have to give them bread and peace, or they're going to overthrow me the way that they overthrew Kerensky and then they overthrew Nicholas, right? And so Lenin ends up in charge of the country, right? And almost from the beginning, Lenin decides that you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs, right? You can't make the kind of society you want and you need without killing people, right? Without using violence to sort of cement your power. And you want to come over here and get some love, or you don't like me? Come here. No? Why don't you go hang out with your friend Tim then? That's all right. See if he gives you treats tonight. Boom, you're looking for that. Think about it. Probably will. You have chosen wisely. Yes. And so what Lenin starts doing is this wave of repression, right? I mean, they start seizing property from aristocrats. They start throwing political opponents in jail. They start, like shooting people and arresting people, and like people flee the country. And you got to understand from the perspective of the Russian communists, the worst thing you can be is, the aristocrats and the upper class people, they have to hate those people. It's like a fact of life. But those people, the government doesn't worry about them because like everybody hates them now, right? The worst thing are actually the other liberal parties, right? I mean, the Social Democrats are the party that would have done the things that Lenin did without killing people, right? And if you're Lenin, they're the kind of people that are the biggest threat because they promise an alternative goal of getting what you're going to get, but without you getting the power, without you doing it, and without the kind of violence that you think is necessary, right? And so they're stealing your thunder, right? And since the dawn of time, if you're a person who follows a religion, the worst thing isn't somebody who is from another religion. They're just an idiot. The worst thing is someone who does your religion differently. Right? They're a heretic. Right? They're a real threat. They could convince people that follow your faith to do it the wrong way, right? I mean, they can convince people away from your church, right? And so for Lenin and all communists at all times, for almost all of communist history, the worst thing would be other liberal parties, other parties of the left, because they might convince voters and potential revolutionaries that maybe we don't need revolution, we don't need violence, right? We could like parliamentary solutions or whatever is possible, right? And that's I think a key thing to keep in mind. There's a time where Stalin will tell people not to kill them and sort of do what's called a united front, but it's really different, right? It's a tactical thing, right? And so Lenin takes power. What can we say about Lenin communism in Russia in the teens? Well, Lenin at first does sort of war communism. They have a civil war in Russia. They're still fighting the remnants of the Tsarist government, being aided by the British, among other things. Thank you, Winston Churchill. And Lenin does war communism, where they basically like enforce communism. They start seizing factories. They start making things happen. They start sort of doing communism. It's crash communism, whatever. And eventually it fails in the 20s. And Lenin institutes something he calls the new economic policy, which is to say they sort of do this. Did you shut the door? Okay. They do this sort of go back to capitalism a little bit. They like wind the clock back. And Lenin essentially tactically admits that perhaps communism, sort of crash communism was like not a super idea, and we've got to go back. No, it's fine. I'm getting one.
Stephanie, the file tells us that Among Us is being hacked by the Russians.
Among Us is being hacked by the Russians?
No,
well,
Dan told me that Trump is hacking. Trump is paying someone to hack Among Us.
why would Trump? It's a really good video game. Why would Trump want to hack Among Us?
He wants money.
He's going to extort the creator of Among Us for money?
No, he's doing it. I don't understand why, but I think he's doing it for his money. His money.
Yeah, they're really good.
Do you want to text him?
Tim, just make sure someone else is out there.
I mean, I'm going to go see the fire. Hold on, everyone. I'm going to go see the fire. Holy crap, it's a big fire. Dara, do you want to message him on Facebook? Oh, he's coming. He's coming. Yeah, it's a big fire. Look. Oh, we put it out. Yeah, it's cool. Fire's cool. It's dangerous, kids. Yeah, we got to look that up, everyone, because... What's that? Who is saying Putin 2020? Oh, is that what it's? Someone's hacking like the like little news ticker in the game or something? Because there's a little like thing that pops up.
Trump canceled. Like Trump's the reason Among Us 2 canceled.
Yeah.
It's not, okay.
Yeah, I mean, currently I didn't have any idea that Among Us 2 was in development.
Among Us 2 is not being developed. What they're going to do instead is just improve Among Us.
Yeah, I mean, Among Us has only been out for a little while. It's only gotten famous like 2 months ago.
It was developed. They were developing Among Us 2, but since it's trying to get hacked,
yeah, it's not.
Yeah, I mean, I would think that Among Us 2, you would make all the money you can make off Among Us 1 before you would make Among Us 2. Also, Among Us 1 doesn't even have, it has 3 maps. So I would really rather have there be more content for Among Us 1 before we start trying to buy Among Us 2.
Yeah, but apparently it's the hack that keeps promoting Trump 2020.
Yeah, oh, okay, I get it. There's a little news sticker in the game.
in the chat, I have talked about communism.
I mean,
It's very important Among Us news. Yeah, in the chat, does it say Trump,
Well, I haven't seen it, but that's what Dan is telling me, that that the hacker is making bots or something to vote Trump 2020.
Yeah, that won't backfire at all.
Pop wants to know what fire.
Oh, it was a fire. Our next door neighbor's grill is visible, and Darren just looked over and saw it. Yeah, it was a huge grill fire, so it was pretty cool. It was Corey who's sort of sitting and is able to look easily and was like, "Oh my God, that's a fire!" And then we all ran to go look at my neighbor's grill who's on fire. I'm like, yeah, me? What? And she's like, no, the fire. And you're like, oh, cool.
No, the fire is out, Evan. I'm sorry.
No, the fire got put out. So one of the coolest things I've ever seen was a burning car. So that was cool. Yeah, it was really. We were going to the mall, and we were with my parents, there was a burning car on the side of the road, and my dad pulled over, and I thought he was like going to offer assistance, and instead he was like, "Should I back up? Can everyone see?" And we all watched the car burn. The tires like blew up and stuff, and it was like a chemical truck, so it had a bunch of chemicals in the back. And then like the fire department showed up and put it out, and it was like, okay, well,
Like, okay, let's do it.
yeah, we just drove to the mall. What's that? Yeah, I mean the guy.
Person was outside,
Yeah, no, the person was like, "Oh my God, my car is on fire!" Like he was standing like 10 feet away, and he was like, "Oh God, my car." So he was like, because it was like, "Oh my God, is it dangerous?" Nah, it's like a pickup truck, and there was just one guy, and it was like his work truck caught on fire or something. So, what else can we say about? Issa's like, "Yeah, you can continue to do that. It's fine." Issa, you're very fat.
Well, no wonder she doesn't want to hang out with you. Tell the girl she's fat.
Oh, she's my fat cat.
Stephanie has a story of a time that her neighbor's car caught fire and she never said holy shit so much on 911.
A car fire is wild. It was wild. And it was a little scary because it was like a pickup truck full of like work tools and stuff. So you don't know it was like paint or something. Is it dangerous? Is it like chemicals? Because there was a time there was a chemical truck that got caught on fire in Jacksonville somewhere, and they had to close like a chunk of 95 because it was full of apparently flammable toxic chemicals. And so it was like, what's that?
There was another time with the beer truck.
Yeah, it's beer. Well, yeah. So anyway, Lenin eventually dies, and he's a sick guy. They called him, even at a young age, they called him Starik in Russian, which means old man. And so he was succeeded by Yosef Isyaronovich Yugashvili, a Georgian seminary student / communist revolutionary / bank robber who took the nom de guerre Man of Steel, who called himself Stalin. Right, and so Stalin essentially did the thing you want to do when you want to take over society, which is take over the security services. He took over the secret police, and then when Lenin died, what Stalin was able to do is kill anybody who was a threat and like take over. And so Stalin ruled Russia from like the late 20s all the way up to the early 50s, right? And so Stalin's rule in Russia was marked by a couple things. And we should mention that, of course, there's a big argument philosophically about communism in that the Soviet Union is what Russia was called. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics is what it was named. And you can argue that it was a real national thing, but really what it was Russia and its empire of states that it forced to adopt communism at gunpoint. There's an argument that philosophically communism is separate from the Russian implementation as such. In other words, we've never really seen actual communism. Like the Russians did it in this specific way that they kind of had to, and all other. It's like what they say in law when you illegally search somebody and you get evidence and you go to court and they say, well, you can't admit this evidence to the case because it's the fruit of a poison tree, right? It was the search was bad, so the evidence has to be illegal. Right, and so you can argue that all subsequent communist implementations, anywhere from Cuba all the way to North Korea, are sort of descendants of this initially flawed Russian communism. On the other hand, it's like, yeah, but we've never really seen it work anywhere else either. So outside of abstract utopian philosophy, But it's important to note that all subsequent discussion of communism has to proceed from an analysis of this real world implementation that was sort of done by the Russians, right? And so, having said that, what did Stalin implement Russian communism as? Well, the first thing we can mention is that he created the Gulag. Gulag stands for General Administration of Labor Camps. And the abbreviation in Russian was spelled Gulag, Gulag. And the Gulags were dozens and later hundreds of camps all over the Soviet Union that were prison camps. And they were economically useful. They provided raw materials for the Russian economy. They cut timber and they pumped oil and they get food and they mined stuff. But they also served as a place that housed at their height somewhere between 20 and 30 million Russian prisoners, often people who were criminals, but also, depending on some cases, a majority of them were political prisoners. People who simply just, would somehow attracted the attention of the Russian government. And sometimes they were people who you might say there's a legitimate reason to put in prison. They were actual political activists. But by the height of Stalinism in the 30s, often people just would, had quotas. The security services in every oblast or every province and every county and municipality simply had quotas. And they just had to round up 10 people. So if you're the local seat party, if you're local NKVD, the Russian Secret Service is called the Cheka, the GRU, the NKVD, or the KGB, depending on when you talk about it, right? So a lot of historians will put a little note at the beginning of the book listing all the names and when they're used, and then just to say, I'm just going to call them the KGB so that you're not confused. And so if you're a local KGB guy, KGB stands for Committee for State Security. And he's got directorates, and Directorate 5, I think, is the spying one, and Directorate 3 is border security and whatever. So if you're the local KGB guy, you just get a notice from Moscow, from Party Central, and you're like, okay, well, I have to round up 10 people. And so maybe there's like a guy you know is actually a subversive, and you're like, well, we'll get Mikhail the subversive, and his family gets us down to we need 6. And you're like, you just say to the KGB agents, all right, find me 6 people who you don't like, or don't pay you a bribe, or look at you funny, or would be beneficial for them to be on a train to Siberia. And so millions of people get swept up by the KGB, and they get tortured, they get executed, they get sentenced to 25 years in the Gulag, and that's for no real reason. It's complete madness. But Stalinism is so terrifying. Everybody reports on everybody else. Everybody's a spy. You have no idea. You can't say anything in public. You can't criticize anything. You get hauled into Lubyanka prison in Moscow. And so it's sort of paralyzing. The entire country is sort of wrapped in this sort of grip of fear, right? And so the other thing we can mention is that the structure of the government is that there's a Russian government. And yet what happens is it's dominated totally by the Communist Party, CPSU, Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, essentially the way it works is that we have a one-party state. So imagine if we had a one-party state in America as one political party. Well, you don't really need to have elections to fill the government positions, because there's only one party. So there'd be primaries to determine who is in charge of the party. And once you determine the party hierarchy, they would just fill all the government, like the head of the party would just be the president, right? And then he'd just pick 535 members to just be Congress. You would need elections because there's only one party, right? And so the Russians essentially argued that that was the case, right? The Communist Party is going to run everything. It will be the vanguard of the revolution. And there's a term called democratic centralism, where we don't need democracy in the country because we just have to make the decisions that are necessary to implement socialism. So the party itself is going to have democracy at the highest level, at the Politburo, the political bureau of the party. They're going to discuss stuff and debate stuff, but when they decide what is best, they're just going to do it. And so at the center of the party, you had democracy. Anywhere else, it wasn't necessary, right? You didn't need it. It was irrelevant, right? And so when people said, oh, there's no democracy in the Soviet Union, the Russians would say, of course, and this is some bullshit, they'd be like, no, 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 at the center of the party, there's democracy, right? There's voting. Yeah, I can't even hear it, but it must be annoying.
Every now and then.
Yeah. And so, having said that, Stalin's not really he's the premier of the Soviet Union, but he's sort of also the head of the Soviet Communist Party, right? Which is that's his more important job, right? And so what happens? Well, of course, the defining event in Soviet communism is World War II. Right? Stalin pushes forward a series of horrific and bloody reforms in the 30s. They force all of the peasants in Russia onto collective farms called kolkhozes. They round up any recalcitrant farmers and call them kulaks, which are essentially rich peasants. It's an artificially invented term for people that aren't good communists, and they shoot them and take their property. And of course, what communism does in Russia is annihilate the economy, right? I mean, agricultural production drops to the bottom, industrial production tanks, poverty increases, there's mass famine, right? I mean, it's terrible. But Stalin sort of does all this because, again, if you complain, you just get shot, right? I mean, if you don't like it, you're going to end up in the ditch with a 9mm bullet in the back of your brain. And so, and then what happens is along comes Hitler. And Stalin argued, like a lot of communists, that the Great Depression represented the ultimate failure of capitalism, right? Lenin had always said that capitalism would reach its highest point and then collapse, right? And he kept saying it's going to keep getting bigger right up until it collapses. So, like, watch for that, right? And if you think communism is succeeding, it's like it's actually rotting from within. He wrote a book called Imperialism is the Highest Form of Capitalism. To explain this. And so the Great Depression, a lot of communists thought, like, that's it, right? And to be fair, a lot of people thought that. Like, a lot of people everywhere thought the Great Depression was so bad because maybe communism or maybe capitalism is just stupid, right? I mean, maybe we just ran this particular experiment to its conclusion, right? And so when the Depression sort of created fascism in Italy, Spain, and Germany, to a lesser extent, France and England, right? Stalin argued that, like, the fascists represented the end stage of capitalism. Capitalism revealed its true colors, right? I mean, it's like, the capitalist in the suit is going to rip off his suit, and underneath is a Hitler uniform, right? I mean, his Nazi uniform. This is what they're really like, right? And so, tactically, Stalin cuts a deal with Hitler, right? He cuts a deal with the Nazi-Soviet pact in 1939 to divide up Eastern Europe, to divide up Poland. But for Stalin, it's just tactical. He just isn't ready to fight Hitler, right? And then of course Hitler invades the Soviet Union in 1941, and that leads to his ultimate downfall, right? Fang, did Fang get you? Fang.
He's asleep. He doesn't know.
He's awake now. What's up? Smell my feet. You want to lick my foot? Okay. Fang. And so the trick about all this, though, is that at the end of World War II, the American government and the British government and the Russian government signed an agreement at Yalta, which is on the Black Sea coast, kind of near where the Olympics were in Sochi a couple of years ago. And remember, with the hotel rooms that didn't have beds, and like the door that didn't open, and the bathroom with all the toilets that had no stalls, so you're just sitting there pooping, staring directly at the other person. Right. I mean, it's like just packs of wild dogs in the streets, and also guys beating the shit out of gay people until the Russian government was like, "Oh wait, probably we should tell them to go away." Right. I mean, just whatever. Just hashtag Russia 2020, baby. It's what it is now. Now they have a crazy Nazi biker gang called the Night Wolves that ride around and like blow stuff up, and they have. I mean, it's just Russia is just it's wild country now. I mean, I certainly hope that the kids upstairs aren't starting Nazi biker gangs or invading Ukraine.
Regular biker gangs are okay with just a long time.
I mean, Olivia would love to be in a regular biker gang, although she would probably want to be one that involved like sparkles and pink and stuff.
I'm sure that exists.
Probably. So, did you have a question? Was there? Okay, there are questions. Anybody joining us?
Hawk and Stephanie DeFazio and Evan and Sarah Knight Kettleton was there for a minute. Ashley was there for a minute.
Exciting. And so,
I feel like this might be one of those topics that people don't know enough about to be.
Yeah. So, what happens at the end of the Yalta Agreement is essentially Roosevelt, like they divide Europe in half, right? America, the Allies control Western Europe. Russia, communism controls Eastern Europe. And a lot of people criticize Roosevelt for essentially, he's comfortable, he's relaxing. It's just, I mean, Bodie was doing it the other night, and I almost threw up all over myself because it was a disgusting one. And he was between us. I was amazed that you didn't smell it. But apparently he directed it towards me. Oh, now you're awake. Yeah,
He woke himself up with his.
Yeah, sometimes he will fart and then look at himself like, "What was that noise?" And it's like, you know what it is. Yeah, but what was that? And it's like, it was you farted. Come on, what did you think? So, all right. So anyway, a lot of people criticize Roosevelt for basically selling out Eastern Europe. Remember, what was the reason for World War II in Europe? It was to liberate Poland, right? I mean, it was. Poland was invaded by Germany in September 1st, 1939, and then Russia like 2 days later. And people were like, God, you're just going to sell Poland out. And if Roosevelt could answer his critics, which he couldn't because he died of heart disease like 2 weeks later, right? He would say, look, it wasn't so much that I surrendered Eastern Europe to the Russians. It was that I basically recognized that they were already in control of it. And the only way to get them out of it would have been like World War III, right? I mean, like, does anybody really want to follow World War II directly with World War III? No. Right? And so, he basically ratified that by saying if the Russians agree to basically let us have Western Europe, then, we'll just let them have Eastern Europe, right? They can just have it. And so, oh, are you okay? Did you make a burping? Smell my foot. She likes it. She sleeps on my shoes. And also likes to smell my feet. We'll lick them in the middle of the night. And so, having said that, what you end up with then is Europe after World War II, where countries like Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Yugoslavia, also Poland, the eastern half of Germany, all of these countries get communism. And only in Yugoslavia does communism spread naturally because of the actions of its. I'm feeling I was hiccuping the other day. It's terrible. Through this leader. In every other country, the Russians essentially install communism at gunpoint, right? I mean, they create communist governments. And there's a really good book by a Polish-American journalist, Ann Applebaum, called Iron Curtain, about this process. That what the Russians do is they get control of the government by installing friendly stooges, basically, and everyone knows they are because, of course, they do. And also, then you get control of the schools so that you can essentially teach propaganda, and then you get control of the security services so you can shoot anybody who disagrees, right? And within about 10 years or so, you've pretty much calmed everything down, right? And there's some setbacks. In 1940, I think 7, there's a revolt in Eastern Germany that the Russians have to go in and shoot people. They have to send in the Red Army and shoot people. And in 1948, they stage a coup and they kill, I want to say it's Janusz Kadar, the head of the Czechoslovakian government, and replace him with communist stooges. And everybody in the West is sort of terrified at this. And so Stalin decides that at that point you kind of got to like cool it down a little bit, right? And so that's the Iron Curtain goes up, right? The the division of Europe between basically communist and free. And it's important to note that all of these communist societies come about, with the exception of Yugoslavia, essentially Russian gunpoint, right? And the reason that we tolerate it is because we feel like we don't want to go to war again, right? Europe couldn't handle another war, right? And so, and of course, we have nuclear weapons. But nobody, nobody wants to drop nukes again, right? And of course, what nobody other than Stalin and Truman know, Truman because he's in charge and Stalin because he has spies, is that we don't have any nukes in 1945. We had 3. We tested one in Los Alamos. We dropped one on Hiroshima. We dropped one on Nagasaki. And as you can imagine, they're making the shit out of more. But it's like it takes time, right? And so, of course, a couple years go by. We formed NATO. The Russians formed the Warsaw Pact, right? And there's this general sense that you're going to solve the spread of communism by keeping it from spreading and walling it in. It's famously the policy articulated by the American diplomat George Kennan called containment, where he points out communism is stupid and it's economically inefficient. So if you can keep communism from getting new countries and new resources, eventually it'll just collapse on itself because it will not provide people a living standard, right? I mean, at the end of the day, in 25 or 30 years, the communists are going to be looking at society and saying, wow, our lives aren't any better than our parents were. And that's not what we were promised, right? And they're going to look at America where things get better all the time. And they're going to say, we were told America's society was fatally flawed. And yet in America, they live like kings. And in Russia, we live like paupers. And as late as like the 60s, Russians could not believe things like, for example, ordinary American workers could own a car or a house. If you went and you're like, yeah, like I'm a blue collar factory worker and I have like a, nice little house in a little town and, I have a car and I take a vacation every once in a while and my kids go to school and my wife doesn't work and I work in a factory and, I have like a bank account. You would be unimaginably wealthier than someone in Russia. And so, arguably Kennan was right. At the end of the day in the 80s, what the average Russian was able to do for the first time is see concrete evidence that the Russians they were richer than they had been in the 40s, but not like a lot. Whereas America had like, the space shuttle and like, cassette tapes and blue jeans and rock and roll and MTV. And like the average American lived like 100 times better than the average Russian. And we had a military that was bigger than theirs too, right? We were able to afford the proverbial guns and the butter, right? But in the meantime, you end up with the Russians still pretty powerful, right? And communism begins to spread in the other direction, right? In 1949, there's the revolution in China, where the civil war between the nationalist American-backed Chinese Kuomintang Party and the Russian-backed Communist Party, Chinese Communist Party, ends in Communist Party victory. Right, Chairman Mao famously proclaims the formation of the People's Republic of China in Tiananmen Square. Right, and so I mean that's really scary because it's scary for 2 reasons. The Chinese are huge, right? Their economy is in the toilet. They make like nothing ever. Their GDP is like -$1, but there's a shitload of Chinese people, right? And also, it was scary for us because we Americans had deluded ourselves into thinking that the Chinese were like on our side and that the Chinese communists were weak and that we were going to be able to like win the fight, and so it was one of those things where like you think you're winning right up until the end when the score is revealed and it's actually 70-0 for the other guy. And it was really destabilizing for America to realize. There's a good book about it by a guy, I think his name is James Bradley, where he calls it the China Mirage, right? And we really had led ourselves to think that like we have a chance, like the Civil Wars, we could win it. And of course, it turns out no. If you look at objective historical analysis, no, we were losing the Civil War in China for like 10 years, right? And so the communists in China, did he do it again? I don't know what he ate.
He's just old.
Come on, Fang. I mean, Fang is with one of his favorite people and is getting love, so I mean, he's fine.
He's showing how much he loves her.
He's comfortable and relaxed, so naturally, those things just happen. Yeah. So communism in China is in a way like more radical, right? China is even more agrarian than Russia. There's even a smaller industrial proletariat in China than in Russia. And so correspondingly, in order to make the revolution happen, Mao has to like push harder, right? I mean, he has to force it to happen more. And part of the revolution in communist revolution in China, part of it's about making communism happen. Part of it is about the fact that you had two really big things happen in the early 20th century China. The first was the Chinese state basically collapses because of it fails, the economy's bad, foreign powers are like deeply involved in China and they're very unpopular. The Chinese empire collapses in 1912. And so it's not so much you have a communist revolution that happens out of the blue, rather the communists are able to take advantage of the fact that like everything kind of falls apart, right? Which is not the kind of revolution that Karl Marx was really talking about. The other thing you mentioned, of course, World War II. It turns out that the Chinese communists are able to fight the Japanese a little harder. And most importantly, they don't fight them harder so much as they convince everyone they give a shit more. The nationalists actually fight the Japanese a little more than the communists. Neither side really wants to waste time and effort fighting the Japanese. They want to fight each other. The worst enemy the nationalists have is the communists, and vice versa. But the communists are able to in the 20s and 30s, they had evacuated from southern China after being defeated by the nationalist armies all the way south and then west and then north, all the way out to the far west of China, where they took a refuge in a place called Yinan, and they carved these caves out of these sandstone cliffs and lived in the caves, right? And it was mythologized among Chinese communists as the Long March, which was this heroic moment where the Chinese communists put all their shit in a backpack, left everything else behind, kissed their family goodbye, and just marched off into the Western China. So understandably, the Chinese communists kept pointing out, like, hey, don't expect us to be fighting the Japanese. They're in Eastern China, we're in Western China. What the fuck are we supposed to do, right? It's the nationalist Kuomintang who controls Shanghai, Beijing, all the part of Eastern China. Like, why aren't they fighting the Japanese? And of course, the nationalists were like, well, we're kind of 50% fighting you, right? And of course, it was to great consternation of Americans, like, for example, Vinegar Joe Stilwell, General Stilwell. And he was a real asshole. That's why they called him that. And Roosevelt and later Truman and Marshall, that like whatever we gave the nationalists, they really didn't seem super enthused about using it against the Japanese, right? They seemed much more interested in shooting the communists, right? Which we were like, do you eat this Japanese? We like really give a shit more about the Japanese thing. And then Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist leader, was like, oh yeah, sure, whatever. And then we would leave and he would be like, fuck that, we're gonna do whatever we want, right? And so, we gave those guys billions of dollars, and Chiang Kai-shek squandered most of it trying to fight the communists, and they ended up capturing most of that stuff anyway. And so when Mao took over, what he did was the nationalists fled to Taiwan. They formed a government in Taiwan, the Republic of China, and it still exists today. You still have Taiwan is the Republic of China, and Communist China is the People's Republic of China, and both claim that they're the legal, rightful government of actual China. And understandably, today, Taiwan is very wealthy, but is, of course, like 1% the size geographically and also population and GDP and stuff. So it's sort of, they have much less of an effective claim on the status of being the real China. And you can't have diplomatic relations with communist China if you recognize Taiwan and vice versa. So we agree that Taiwan is not part of communist China, but not an independent country, but not the same. It was sort of this wonderful split the difference formula where we agree that there is one China, two governments.
Evan wants to know if Hong Kong is important to
Okay, politically, yeah, the Communist Party, the Chinese Communist Party can take it over. Economically, the old argument back in the 90s was that the CCP could not communize Hong Kong because the Hong Sen, the financial index, and like the Hong Kong was too valuable. It's too valuable. Well, now that's not the case, right? I mean, now if Hong Kong gets absorbed into mainland China today, it represents like what, a couple percent of the total GDP of China. Whereas in the 90s, if Hong Kong had been absorbed into mainland China, it would have been like 15% of the GDP of China, and you couldn't risk killing the golden goose, right? Whereas now, you got your own golden goose, right? I mean, the Chinese make more money in Shenzhen and Guangzhou and Shanghai and Beijing and stuff than necessarily you make in Hong Kong. So it's much less, now the Chinese are much less inclined to give the political problem that the Hong Kong democracy movement represents a pass because of its economic importance, because the economic importance isn't as much, right? It's just Hong Kong is not as economically important as it was 20 years ago. And so, yeah, I think essentially they're one day going to take over Hong Kong. And Yes. What did I say? 20? Yeah. Well, I mean, it was like 1999 when they turned over. Yeah. It was 2000, but the British did it early to get it over with because one wants to be done with humiliating concessions, right? And so, having said that, yeah, I think back in the 90s, the Chinese were very recalcitrant about imposing any kind of authoritarian rule in Hong Kong for fear of damaging its economic openness, its sort of capitalist credentials. But now, of course, they view it as a much more salient political problem. The democracy movement, the umbrella movement in Hong Kong, represents a challenge to Communist Party rule that cannot be ignored and might inspire similar movements in mainland China. And the economic problem is no longer an issue, right? It's Hong Kong is no longer as economically significant as it was back when you annexed when you got it in the first place, right? And I think one day the Chinese are just going to institute actual authoritarian rule in Hong Kong, and then basically say to the West, "Look, what are you going to do about it? Are you really going to go to war with us over this shit, or are you just?" And after all, this is a part of our country. Can't we do what we want? Like, doesn't America get to do what it wants in Hawaii? Can't isn't Hawaii part of America? Then why isn't Hong Kong not part of China? Right? It's the way we run our country. And so, are you really going to go to war, World War III, over Hong Kong? And I mean, on the one hand, you should, because the people in Hong Kong have human rights and they have a right to a democratic government that respects their freedom. But on the other hand, yeah, it's madness. Are we really going to go to war and create, a $1 trillion war and devastate 2 continents and cause, untold devastation in the Pacific region because, some Hong Kong people have to say the national anthem when they get sworn into the Legislative Council? I mean, and that's what the Chinese are gambling on, right? They're always going to gamble on the fact that any confrontation with them in the 21st century is going to be probably more valuable than it's worth, right? Is it really worth wrecking the global economy because some Hong Kong teenagers have some problem about democracy, right? And I mean, today, maybe not. Was that Lucas at the door? No, he.
I think it's part of their game.
Oh, well, I mean, wild. Tim's going to find out. It's exciting. If Tim gets eaten by a monster, I don't just jump through the window. I mean, he just opened the door. Okay, they were knocking on the door of the bedroom or some crap.
No knocking.
Freaking me out. And so, what can we say about communism in China? Well, it. What?
He doesn't have his devices tonight.
Oh. What's happened? I mean, this kid just does not understand about playing with fire. I mean, he just does not learn. Well, I mean, how many times is he gonna have to piss you off when you go nuts on him before he learns that, like, maybe? Yeah. I mean, yeah.
For the camera here.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's that's just understandable. Yeah. I'm saying it seems fairly straightforward, right? But I mean, we were all 9. We all. Okay, yeah, but I mean, we all were there. I did stupid stuff too.
I still do.
Yeah.
In fact, we're doing some stupid stuff right now. Getting drunk and watching things about communism. Welcome to your adulthood.
If you're going to get drunk, there's certainly worse things to do than lecture about.
Probably, yeah.
It's not operating heavy machinery.
Okay, so how does Chinese communism compare to Russian?
I mean, it's even in a way. Like initially, it's there's all these questions about how communist is mal for real, right? Like how okay. So in Yugoslavia, the guy that took over Yugoslavia, Josip Broz, they called him Tito, right? And I always make a Jackson 5 joke, but none of the kids in college, they don't know who the Jackson 5 was anymore. So I'm like, it's not the same Tito as Jermaine and what, and they're like, what? And I'm like, oh, fucking kids.
It's not the same vodka then. They'll understand that.
Will they?
Yeah, it's not the vodka guy.
What is the vodka guy?
Tito vodka.
Tito vodka? Oh, I mean, I guess you make a Tito Puente joke, but they probably don't listen to salsa either. So, yeah, I mean, of course, we've all, yeah. Who Shot Mr. Burns Part 1 and Who Shot Mr. Burns Part 2? And so the question you ever had, Stalin hated Tito, and Tito hated Stalin. And Tito was the only guy.
He says that they totally did get it.
Well, she got it. I explained it to the class. Every once in a while, you get an adult student who is like, "Oh, a Jackson 5 joke," but like most of the high school dual enrollment kids are like, "What's the Jackson 5?" Yeah.
MJ, Janet, and the rest. Oh, the rest.
The Jermaine, Tito. I don't even remember. all of them, frankly.
I mean, Shane is dual enrollment, so we can ask Evan if Jackson 5.
Yeah, do you know, yeah, Shane, do you know who the Jackson 5 are? It's super important to know for reasons.
Communism.
Yeah. So,
Communistic reasons.
communistic reasons. So the question everybody had was, is Mao an Asian Tito, right? Tito didn't like Stalin, and understandably, Stalin wanted to tell Tito what to do. Stalin, I'm the leader of the International Soviet, what's that? Marlin, okay. And so Stalin said, I'm the leader of the communist movement, right? Every communist country in the world owes allegiance to me. Well, if you're East Germany, yeah, if you're the communist leader, Erich Honecker, you do owe allegiance to Stalin. He put you in charge. You can't openly acknowledge it, but you must kind of acknowledge it. But Tito was the only communist leader who could tell Stalin to go fuck himself and be able to say it, because he didn't owe Stalin anything. You didn't put me in charge. I put myself in charge. And so everybody thought, wondered, is Mao an Asian Tito? And of course, Mao was like, no, I'm an Asian Stalin lover, right? Like I'm with Stalin 100%, right? And so that created this idea of the monolithic block of communist powers, right? All communists are together marching in the same beat. Not, of course, Tito, but I mean Yugoslavia is pretty small, so whatever. And so that was really scary, right? And inside of communism, Mao moved to assert his control, right? In the 50s, they had the anti-rightist campaign where they got rid of anybody who was a rightist, and a rightist is defined as someone who is not communist or someone who Mao doesn't like. Right? They had a great movement where Mao said about intellectuals, let 100 flowers bloom. The garden is prettier if you have varieties of flowers. And so that should be the way that society is. So everybody started writing essays about how the communists were making bad choices, right? I mean, like they were like, look, the ideas are great, but this official is corrupt, or this policy is stupid, or this idea is not a very good idea. This is not how things should be. And then Mao had all those people rounded up and shot. Right? It's great if your opponents will announce themselves in public with their names on newspaper op-eds. You just look them up in the phone book and have them shot, right? And so it was great. What's that? I mean, it's like a paper version of Google for phone numbers.
Whitepages.com.
Yeah.
How many of these leaders actually believed in the communist model, or were they just so focused on retaining power that they were talking about this grand idea and every?
That's the $1 million question. Did some of them really, I think, did believe it? Like Khrushchev, I think really did. Khrushchev was this poor kid from Donbass in eastern Ukraine who got to go to education and got a job. And like, if you talk to Khrushchev, you'd be like, the Communist Party gave me I would be a miner in a slag pit if it wasn't for the communists, right? I mean, they gave people like me a chance to be, actual, have a chance at life, And so I think, he really did. But I think some of the later communist leaders, guys like Andropov and Chernenko, they were just time servers. I mean, they were people who thought, yeah, the society we live in is probably fucked, but like everyone is kind of, always. And if you, yeah. And if I change it, who's going to be pushed up against the brick wall and shot? It's not those guys. It's going to be me. I'm the one I'm signing the checks here, right? And so I think some of those guys are. On the other hand, I really don't know about Mao. Like, you can make an argument that he really did believe this stuff. There's a point where, at the end of the day, it becomes about power for everybody in a way. Yeah. And Frederick Douglass said power's never going to give up power without a fight, because that's why it is what it is, right? And so, yeah, I think, there's a point where Mao sort of embraces communism revolution for its own sake, just as a way to make sure that he's still in charge. Right. And of course, none of these guys ever demonstrate the idea that if you can come up with a criticism of them that is legitimate communism, they would be like, oh, you're right. I'm wrong, and we should fix this. And that would be the ultimate. If you really believe in communism, then you would be willing to embrace the fact that the ideas are right and you can be wrong, so you need to change your view. And that never happens, right? I mean, those guys, yeah, exactly. The prison camps are full of people who are right, but you put in jail anyway because you're not going to give up power because some guy criticizes you or whatever, right? And so I think for a lot of these guys, it does become about power, right? And he's, some other than more than others. I think Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam really believed in communism, not because he believed in the economic doctrines per se, but because he viewed communism as something that would allow him to liberate his people, right? I mean, he's like, I want independence for Vietnam, and Castro, to a degree, I think, was another guy who Che Guevara definitely viewed communism as like, this is how you free people and this is how you give people a better life, and revolution is good because the capitalists are the bad guys. And so if you have to have something to oppose them, and this is what it is. So I think some guys, yeah, they do believe it. Other guys, you can maybe make a criticism of, and some of the Eastern European guys are true believers because Stalin picks them because they are, right? He picks them because guys like Ulbricht or Ceausescu or Honecker in Germany or so on. And I think, guys like Nicolae Ceausescu is in, I think, Romania. I think he starts out as a true believer, but Lord Acton, the British historian, said absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? And I mean that's what happens to those guys. What? No, with great power comes great responsibility. Or as Tom Holland said, I think if you have the kind of power I have, and the bad thing happens, and you don't stop it, then the bad thing happens because of you. Which is a good way of rephrasing Stan Lee's, of course, iconic quote, with great power comes great responsibility, right? So it's a good scene. It was in Spider-Man Homecoming, was it Spider-Man Homecoming? Or was it Civil War? It was Civil War. Where he sits down in his room and he says to Iron Man, I think if the bad thing happens and you could have stopped it, then it happens because of you.
So does that mean no power, no responsibility?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah. Yeah. And so, I think you can argue that some of the leaders, I mean, Ceausescu is, I think, the most egregious kind of grotesque personality cult in Eastern Europe. His wife, Elena Ceausescu, was a scientist. She had like an undergraduate degree in science, and she was the chief scientist of Romania. And so when any scientific paper published in Romania, she was the co-author. And so, I mean, she was like a chemist or something. And so if you wrote like a scientific paper about like astrophysics or something, you had to include her as a co-author. And then they would like, everybody did this and knew it was bullshit, right? But then they would go to conferences and they would be like, guys, Elena Ceausescu, the greatest scientist in our country, she published 10,000 scientific papers that she co-authored last year. And of course, you're clapping because technically that's true, but everybody knows that's just because you were legally ordered to put her name on the paper. It was stupid, right? What was that? Could you go ask them to not do that? Oh my God.
He didn't go ask.
Just throw them in the lake. 20 years gulag. Chop trees with a hatchet. That'll teach him. Probably won't.
Yes, that's your hair. That's your hair. Don't eat it.
She's like, it's a toy. Oh God, don't let the clump of hair. So years ago, we were playing D&D, and the description for the room that we entered in the dungeon was that there was a wolf that lived in it, and so there were these big tufts of gray hair on the floor of the room. And I just finished describing how I get tumbleweeds of gray hair in my office because we have a dog that's black and white and a cat's black and white, and they get gray hair tumbleweeds. And so Karen was like, "Oh, this is like Matt's office. It's got tumbleweeds of gray hair." And I was like, "Great, thanks."
No.
Ita. She's like, "I'm just going to aggressively clean myself," which is I wasn't doing anything. I was just, yeah. She'll just be like, "Oh, I'm just giving myself a bath. I wasn't doing anything." Like what? Like what? Yeah. I was teaching class, and she's sitting in the chair next to me in my desk, and she just like lifts up the leg and starts cleaning down there, and like you can just see it on the monitor, and I'm like, "Turn the chair." I'm like, "What the hell are you doing?" And so the students thought it was great. The other day, she started swatting books off my desk because I wouldn't pay attention to her during class, and she's like, "Is this a cool book? Push. Is this a cool book? Push." My friend Matt's cat, his old cat Yenlo Wang, would aggressively chase and lick Yenlo Wang. Yenlo Wang. It's a Chinese name. Technically, it's Capellan Confederation name. So all hail our beloved Chancellor. If anyone gets that, comment immediately. Kudos to you. Yeah, I mean, like Yenlo Wang Hawk would like bring a plastic bag, and he would be like, "Is it a plastic bag? Is it for me?" And it's like, I don't. It must feel good on their tongue, right? It must, like, the texture of it or something must be like satisfying. Yeah, and it's a weird like noise, and you're like, ugh. Anyway, cats are weird. Cats are weird. And so, what can we say then about Chinese communism? It had this sort of crazy, almost rigid ideological cast too. In the '60s, Mao's power was being eclipsed, as Stalin's was, by his contemporaries. So Mao created what he called the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, where he argued that the revolution has lost its way. Well, we should mention contextually, in the mid-50s, Mao decided that we needed to create communism in China by industrializing the country overnight. And he did what they called the Great Leap Forward. So everybody took all their iron and they melted it in furnaces in their backyard to scrap iron. And we built all these collective farms. And we just industrialized the country. And what happened? What happened in China? Well, as it turns out, and I don't know if you know this, but if you make a clay furnace in your backyard and you melt all of your pots and pans in the furnace, you get what's called pig iron, which is useless because you're not an iron worker. None of us are iron workers. No one watching this is an iron worker. And the communist government was just like, we'll just tell, Corey over here how to do that and she'll do it. No, she won't because she's not a freaking iron worker, right? Well, actually, you should not. Well, what you really are now is because you're a bourgeois lawyer, you've been sent to work in the farm because obviously we need to beat that out of you, right? So it's not my fault you adopted one of the professions. It was, bourgeois profession. I mean, what are we supposed to do about that?
I don't want to support communism.
No. I mean, do you want to go to Gulag for 20 years? Because that's what they do to people who are, lawyers, right? I mean, you're a realtor, so that's an actual parasitic occupation that simply makes money off of the sale of property, which is well, that's why she's in Gulag. That's why she's already in the Gulag.
That money buys all of your things.
We're transaction facilitators.
Yeah, which is parasites, as they would be known. I mean, look, I'm an intellectual. I didn't go to the Gulag. I got shot because I'm smart enough to be able to tell people why communism's dumb. So they went ahead and liquidated me immediately. Right? I'm a member of the intelligentsia. Right? And so we should mention, by the way, one of the ironies of communism is that to make communism happen in Russia, you actually needed to create a bureaucratic class of government workers to sort of operationalize all the government directives and all the bureaucracy of communism. And so they called these guys in Russia the nomenklatura, and they gave them special privileges, right? And so the funny thing is, communism is supposed to abolish social class. We're supposed to basically have one social class, the people, and yet in Russia, you ended up creating three classes: the elite, the nomenklatura, and then everybody else, right? Maybe even four, because you had the Gulag people, right? And so the irony is the Soviet society in Russia was more classist than Russian society had been before, maybe, or at least as classist, right? And so the nomenklatura, who got perks because of their associated with the communist government, they got like better apartments, they got access to stores that had more goods, they got like better pay, they got all kinds of wonderful things, trips abroad and better education and stuff. And so the irony is the Russians perpetuated the same kind of inequality that they supposedly decried. Every communist government has done this. Every communist government creates a circle of the elites in the middle, the loyalists close, and then everybody else on the outside. In 1984, they called it the inner party and the outer party. Everybody's in the party, but in the inner party, you're really in the party and you get like benefits. The outer party's for losers, right? And you want to be for the inner to the outer, but it's very hard to go from the outer to the inner party because you have to like get a connection somehow. Ironically, just like it is to get in the middle class, right? Just like it is to go in the upper class, right? And so that's one of the great ironies of the Soviet system is the perpetuation of and of course what they did is they shuffled all the social classes around, right? What made you a high social class in 1916 was not going to make you a high social class in 1920, right? And the bases for the class system changed, but there still was one, right? Which was not supposed to be a thing, but it was, right? Which is fascinating. It's a really good book by a guy, I forget his name. It's called The House of the Government, and it's about the Russians, the Soviets built a giant apartment building in Moscow on a swamp. And it had like apartments and schools and shops and a theater and like a gym and everything in it. And all of the yeah. And so and it sort of had this miniature Soviet society, and it was all for the nomenklatura, right? It was all for the nomenklatura. And he wrote a really good book. It's like 1,000 pages long, but it's a history of the government house and all the people that lived in it. Who came and went and got, when there were purges, people from, got sent to the Gulag for the House of the Government, and then people got rewarded apartments in the House of the Government and everything. And so it's a fascinating in miniature look at Soviet society, right? It's one of those books that got great reviews, totally have it upstairs. You pick it up, it's 1,000 pages, you put it down again, and you're like, oh, I'll get back to it, right? And so it always ends up being one of those books that you want to read, but don't, right? And so we should mention, by the way, good books about Russian communism. My two favorite books about Russian communism are by a guy named Orlando Figes. Now, I know Orlando Figes a few years ago did make a fake account and review bomb books by authors critical of him, which is a real thing that happened. I swear to God, it's nuts. But he wrote 2 really good books about Russian communism. People's Tragedy is a history of the Russian Revolution, and The Whisperers is a history of ordinary people's lives under Stalinism, which is really good because Stalin really tried to erase the concept of personal life. They lived in communal apartments. You shared spaces with everybody. They tried to create a society where the old kind of ways of doing things didn't exist. So you'd make a new person, right? You'd make New Soviet Man, is what they called it. And it did work, right? It was, and of course, it was crippled, as you might imagine, by fear, poverty, and then World War II. But it's a fascinating account of what people's lives are like. Right? And of course, the single best history of the Gulag is by the same woman I mentioned before, Anne Applebaum. And of course, you can also read a lot of Gulag literature. There's, of course, memorably Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Desinovich, and also the Gulag Archipelago. And there's an honorary mention. There's a guy named Varlam Shalamov who was imprisoned in Kolyma, which is a mining camp located in far eastern Siberia on the Sea of Okhotsk, northwest of Japan. And he wrote 2 books of short stories called Kolyma Stories and then Stories from the Criminal Underground, I think is what they called it. And the New York Review of Books have translated both of those into English for the first time completely and issued them as paperbacks. And they're full of they're these collections of short stories about life in the Gulag, which is really, terrible, right? I mean, he was in the Gulag for like 25 years, right? And so Chinese communism was like more radical. The failure of the Great Leap Forward, the failure of the famine and the industrial crash and everything, they led Mao to realize he had screwed the goose, right? I mean, he had lost power. So the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution was a way to stop this, to reassert his power. And he alleged that the government wants to take power away from me. I'm the real communist, the great helmsman, as they called Mao. And if they take power away from me, we're not communist. And he essentially went around the party elites to the kids who had been fed a steady diet of communist propaganda for like 20 years at this point. And he said to them, you have to make communism happen. And they did. The kids formed these groups called Red Guards, took over their schools, beat the crap out of anybody that was officially communist, hanged people, shot people. There was a civil war in China between these various groups over like who was the most communist, right? They did all this great stuff. They changed the stoplights from green to red because red is the color of communism, so it is the forward progressive color. So red means go, and green, the capitalist color of money, means stop. And it turned out that was everybody quietly would just sort of this worked very so we'll just change it, right? And I mean that was in the 60s. There's probably never been a bigger, more radical communist experiment than that, and it just was chaos, right? I mean, and nobody really knew. There was no news coming out of China in the 60s. You could not. There was no information. So I mean, we didn't really know. China was a black hole, right? There was no information coming out, and so it was just sort of crazy, right? And so in the 70s, it got better because that kind of burned itself out. And what happened is you got. Are we getting late? Have we gone on for a while?
No, but I am waiting for you to finish this before I ask.
Okay. Well, we should mention, to put a long story short, to end China's thought. In the 70s, late 70s, a guy who had himself suffered at the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, his name is Deng Xiaoping, he takes over. He takes over China, and famously, he evinced a more pragmatic attitude. And there's a story. He goes on a tour of Shenzhen, and they had created a special economic zone in Shenzhen, China, southern China, it's across the river from the Pearl River Delta from Hong Kong. And a special economic zone is basically a little zone in China where communism would not happen and capitalism would happen. And Deng famously gave a speech where he said, and this is really Chinese, he said, it does not matter whether the cat is black or white. It only matters if the cat can catch mice. And everybody was like, in America, it was like a weird poem. And everybody in China was like, because it's very Chinese to like read a poem and like everyone, you're not saying it, but you're saying it, but you didn't say it, but we get it. So it's cool. And what Deng Xiaoping was basically saying was, what matters about a political, social, and economic system is, does it produce results? And if capitalism makes you rich, which it seems to do, and communism makes you poor, which the Chinese would say it seems to do, then maybe we need to tinker with it. And that led the way to China becoming essentially a dictatorial, authoritarian country today, politically today, that has essentially communism as like the name, right? I mean, they're essentially a capitalist dictatorship not so much really a communist country. But of course, they're still run by the Communist Party, so they're not going to like change the name or anything, right? And if they did change the name, which would make sense to the Chinese, dictator party or something, then people would ask questions like, does that mean that communism is stupid? And if so, why are you still in charge? And then they would have to shoot that person, and they don't want to do that. So instead, we're all gonna keep the name Chinese Communist Party, and everyone understands that like the meaning of that has just changed, right? And so that's great, right? And so I mean that's kind of where China is today, right? But you have questions.
I don't have questions, but I do have one last thing I want you to talk about, which is a bit more pertinent to today's political economic sphere, is when you are driving down the road and you see the supporters out there saying that they don't want communism or they don't want socialism, with our American democracy and things like that. What are they talking about?
I mean, where the rubber meets the road for those people would be government control of the economy, right? And to be totally fair, what communism always meant was the government would control the economy. We would not allow capitalists to control the economy. You wouldn't allow random rich dude to own a factory. The government would take the factory. The government would control it, right? And that's what those guys mean, right? I mean, that's what that. So I guess in a sense, the ultimate end goal that those guys wanted to decry is the idea that like we can't allow the government to take over the economy because it will fail. It won't be freedom. It'll be terrible, right? Yeah, they're telling you to come all the way around so that you can stay off camera, or you could just walk. I mean, or okay.
That's actually what I meant.
Okay, all right, never mind.
Over the IKEA pieces that I wasn't sure.
No, they don't hold weight, and my God. And so, of course, the reality is it's more nuanced than that, right? I mean, Joe Biden and even Bernie Sanders are not saying that nobody in America is saying the government should take over the economy. Right. Well, Teresa's mentioning democratic socialism. What Bernie Sanders would say if he were here is he would say, look, I don't really want to take over the economy because the government doesn't need to run like your local paper mill, right? It doesn't need to run like the factory in your town. But we do have to have like regulations to prevent things like pollution and corruption, and we do need to make sure that like the factory is paying a livable wage and providing like health and safety regulations. And so the democratic socialists would say, hey, what we need are socialist-esque goals to create a fairer, more just society where resources are distributed not according to the whims of the free market, but according to like ethics and rationality. Like everybody gets a fair share and that kind of thing. And you would do that by having the government step in and tip the scales, right? I mean, if it's you and your factory owner boss, who can help you even things out? Well, the government can, right? Which is its job. And of course, the critics of that would say, yeah, but when the government interferes with the economy, it's not going to be like first of all, the economy is going to get worse. I mean, look what happened in every communist country. The government took over the economy and they're all poor, which is, to be fair, is a fairly legitimate complaint. No communist country's ever gotten rich pursuing communism. China got rich pursuing capitalism with a state flavor, right? Okay, it's just total chaos here. And so, yeah, I mean, that's what Bernie Sanders and the Democratic Socialists would be saying is like, we really need to create a society where the government steps in to ensure that things are fair, equitable, and just. Critics of that would say, look, when the government gets into society and it starts messing around the economy, you get, the law of unintended consequences, right? And it tends to produce, negative outcomes, right? Yeah, just go. Okay, Sarah, just running around. And so, I mean, I think that's the crucial difference. The socialists in Europe, which is where democratic socialism comes from, are not the kind of guys that produce revolutions, right? I mean, this is like your your Swedish guys, your Finnish guys, and your Danish and Norwegian guys who would say, look, you can produce a society that's fair and equitable by having like strong government regulations and forcing people to obey laws. You don't need a violent revolution to achieve those. You don't need to be locking people in the gulag and stuff, right? And so it is in a sense a kind of sleight of hand when you talk to conservatives and they're like, oh, socialism is bad. We don't, Bernie Sanders is not Lenin or Karl Marx, right? I mean, he's a guy who would have much more transparent goals than that. On the other hand, of course, you can argue that if Bernie Sanders was Lenin, he's not exactly going to say, yeah, I'm a Bolshevik and I want to take power and shoot everybody. He's going to take power and then do the shooting part, right? And in fact, in Britain, the Fabian socialists famously argued in the 60s and 70s that in order to transform Britain into a socialist country, you don't say you're going to do that. You instead do what they called a long march through the institutions. You don't literally march from Hunan province to Yan'an province in China. Instead, what you do is you take over the schools, you take over the colleges, and you take over the government, and you use your influence in those institutions to transform them into a more socialist version of what you want, right?
No. I am listening.
Then get a snack.
He was taking a picture of me because I had my eyes closed.
I mean, you both did.
10 miles.
I mean, that's fine. That's fine.
Yet you feel you need photographic
I like to point out I ran
evidence.
45 miles and didn't fall asleep in the lecture. So
Did you run 45 miles today?
Last week.
Oh, last week. I was like, today? Wow. I didn't hear about that. I didn't do either of those things. So I read half of my book and also wrangled her all day. So,
You only got 3 hours.
well, and she also ran, and she also took a nap. That added up to a larger time. Also, you were gone for 3 hours.
it felt like 7.
We were gone we went to several stores. Yes. It takes time to park and walk and shop.
I know. Someone's feeling very attacked right now.
By Saturday.
I mean, that's fine. I'm not saying.
Yeah, democratic socialism, capitalism, and the 1%.
Right. Well, I mean, that's and if if you get the Bernie Sanders argument, he would say, look, in order to create in order to rectify the kind of inequality that is inherent in capitalism, you need sort of socialistic policies. But Bernie Sanders would say, like, we don't want to destroy capitalism. You want to temper it. You want to sort of sand off the rough edges, right? Because I mean, if you talk to Bernie Sanders, he would be the first person to say, look, capitalism produces pretty good stuff, right? I mean, like, most of America's wealth was produced by people who work hard and get paid and make money. We just need to maybe fix the problems associated with. You just can't have unrestrained capital. Cars are great, but they need brakes, right? And every once in a while, you got to pump the brakes in order to prevent an accident, right? And so there's a huge difference between democratic socialism in Western countries and communism in, like North Korea or whatever, right? And I don't think Bernie Sanders is suggesting you should vote for him as president, and then he would become like the infallible dictator of America who could not be questioned. Yeah, I mean, he's not suggesting you vote him in and he becomes Kim Jong-un or something like that, right? So there is, and what's that? Kim Jong-Bernie. And so, dear leader, and the European socialists rejected in the 60s and 50s the idea of violent revolution. They said, look, that's just not what we want. We want to make a better society, like in the framework of the one we have, right? I mean, like, don't burn the house down, just like fix it a step at a time, right? Like, do a project every so often to make the house better, right? And so I think that's the difference in kind of, you're not talking about revolutionary stuff, right? And nobody's suggesting, none of the democratic socialist parties, they have the word democratic in the name because they do accept the premises of democracy. They're not talking about violent, revolution the way that the Bolsheviks or the Chinese Communist Party or the Korean People's, it's the Korean People's Workers and Artists Party or the Democratic Party of like Vietnam, the Communist Party of Vietnam or whatever. They're not talking about that kind of violent revolution the way that those parties are, right? And so there's obviously more. I think maybe we'll do this again because we've got to talk about communism in the rest of the world, which we didn't really talk about. So, I mean, that might be a thing we revisit because I think we've kind of reached a point where we've sort of stopped for tonight. We've reached this. Is there any questions? Do we have any other comments or anything?
Not specifically about that.
Just point out that we won't be live next week or the week after. So the next time might be November 14th. Well, it's Halloween next week, and then the week after that, I'm out of town. So unless you want to lecture by yourself.
No, we'll probably just have a hiatus. Well, we would be doing Halloween. Yeah.
I want to enjoy my Halloween.
Yeah, no, Halloween is Halloween on a Saturday. So, like, we're probably going to let that ride. Because usually Halloween's on a Tuesday when I'm at work. So.
But I will probably, especially for our Patreon subscribers, I will probably make you do a couple little vignettes throughout
That's fine.
the next few weeks because of the election cycle.
Yeah, yeah. If there's
So also, like, if people have questions, you can ask that on our Facebook page and things like that, and Matt will get to you about that.
it's true.
We could do a Sunday night one next week too.
That's my birthday.
The first.
Yes.
Yeah, it's his birthday. We're having cheesecake.
Okay. I knew it was November.
Yeah. I mean, it's fine. It's not your job to know that. It's my job to know that. For Tara's birthday, we're trying to get Olivia to stay with her grandparents, probably.
Stephanie says Rolos for college students.
Rolos for college students?
I gave you a bag of Rolos once to bring in on Halloween.
Yeah, I mean, I did that, and everybody, they didn't even like the Rolos. They didn't even pick the Rolos. They picked other things.
It's like you're eating little discs of chocolate.
It's, they're caramel, and they're amazing.
Stephanie
Of,
also says that she wants to talk about Guy Fawkes. So we might do a little vignette about
we talk about Guy Fawkes. Remember the 5th of November, the gunpowder treason and plot. I see no reason why the 5th of November should ever be forgot. Oh, okay. Your birthday is the 20th.
You got like 3 weeks to your birthday.
Yeah, well, no, we're going to have stuff for your birthday.
Stephanie says she picked the
I want
Rolos.
you to make everything just
She picked the Rolos. Well, yeah, because she has taste. But other people were like, Rolos are weird. And I'm like, well, you fail. Because you don't like Rolos. And it was horrible because I ended up eating the Rolos, which is like, I'm not sure I shouldn't do that. But there's a bag full of Rolos and the thing right in front of me. So what am I going to do? Eat the Rolos. Dang. Kids these days. So yeah, thanks for everyone being here. Comment with your questions. Like and subscribe on the Facebook page and YouTube channel. Share, of course, to help us. Subscribe to Patreon if you're interested. Ask other questions. We're probably do little mini videos. No, probably not. But we'll do that later. So anyway, thanks everyone for being here.
You teach on election night, and I don't expect results that night anyway,
No.
but we probably will
Maybe
have some sort of
Wednesday.
video of Matt being very angry as he watches something
Yeah.
because he's always angry
Maybe
when.
Wednesday.
Oh, Stephanie also wants to know that she's, I guess, excited that Leo got an A today on your test.
Oh, okay. Cheers.
I'm sorry to tell you, Stephanie, that Matt is not as involved in the grading anymore now that things are on Canvas because it just does it for him.
No, I mean I grade the quizzes, but yeah, no, I mean cheers. I don't check those grades on the test till like Monday. Yeah, but I mean good for Leo. Leo always wins. Leo always passes because he's the best. So and he can always show up to class and hang out. So
I'm sorry that you're not in
brick and mortar anymore because now's when I would be like, he likes Oreos, he likes
yeah.
the bribery that has not been happening this year.
Yeah. What are you gonna do?
All right, so say goodnight.
Good night, everyone. We'll see everyone again.